Hi, I'm John Persinos, Editorial Director of Investing Daily and Chief Investment Strategist of Marijuana Profit Alert. Welcome to my latest video presentation. With me today for an interview is Adam Stettner, founder and CEO of FundCanna. FundCanna is a financial services company that specializes in cannabis loans, marijuana business financing, and working capital for the entire cannabis supply chain. Adam, thanks for being here today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You bet. You know, marijuana is increasingly legal on the state level, but it remains banned on the federal level. What sort of challenges does that pose for marijuana financing, the fact that the feds still ban cannabis?
Well, it provides a few challenges, namely the fact that of the 15,000 banks that service traditional small business, there are only about 600 to 700 that service cannabis. And of those, maybe 50 of them will lend, and only against real estate. And so what it really does is it puts cannabis business in a position where it's difficult to obtain financing because banks are hesitant to lend to them. I'll go one step further and say that even in a normalized business environment, the approval rate from banks for businesses is typically pretty low, 20 to 25%. In cannabis, you see that number significantly lower due to the federal prohibition.
Well, you know, you don't need a PhD in economics to realize that situation is creating a cash flow crunch for a lot of marijuana companies. Marijuana companies that suffered a cash flow crunch in the last couple of years. Has that gotten any better? Has cash flow improved for marijuana companies lately?
The answer to that is yes. However, of late in 2022 in particular, we saw a lot of both equity and debt in the channels that were servicing this industry. Equity and debt is down significantly, north of 50%. On the equity side, you saw it dry up by over 75% in the last year. But what I would say is the more widespread cannabis becomes, even at the state level with the federal prohibition, the more availability you'll find in the form of, especially in non-bank debt sources.
You know, when you're evaluating prospective clients for financing, for loans, what are the major criteria that you insist on before you dole out some money?
Well, I think first and foremost, the business needs to be operating legally. And so what that means, they need to be in a state that has made cannabis legal. They need to be licensed with the appropriate licenses. They need to be compliant, of course. But second to that, they need to be operating. We do not provide money to startup businesses, businesses that are licensed but not yet operating. And so cash flow is a very important piece. They also need to have a bank account. So I think what I would say is operating businesses that are properly and adequately licensed are the primary criteria for us.
You know, it's no secret that 2022 was a tough one for marijuana equities, but it needs to be kept in context that we suffered a bear market in marijuana stocks. Even though operating results were pretty robust in 2022 for a lot of marijuana companies, they got caught in the downdraft of the overall bear market. So it begs the question, now that it looks like the bear market has bottomed, the overall bear market for equities has bottomed, do you see marijuana stocks bouncing back in 2023? Do you see their share prices catching up to their growth prospects?
Not necessarily. And I will say I am not a bear on the cannabis market and the industry. I am a big believer in the industry. But if we're specifically speaking to the movement of marijuana equities, I think there will be a lag between the opportunity that we see and what's going on right now and a bounce in the stock. So I think 23 will continue to be a very difficult year. However, I think things will normalize in 23 and find a new baseline or foundation from which we can build in the time beyond. So again, very bullish on the space. I think 23 will continue to be a difficult year. There will be some more shakeout. And then I think we grow and we build in the years beyond.
As we saw in the protracted and somewhat embarrassing battle for the House speakership, Congress is gridlocked. There's a lot of bitter partisan rancor on Capitol Hill. Democrats tend to be pro-marijuana. Republicans are starting to come around. They're warming up to cannabis, but the people in charge of the House, so once someone is in charge of the House, they tend to be anti-marijuana. So do you see progress being made on marijuana legislation over the next 2 years, 23, 24? Or do you see a lot of these bills that are pending to legalize marijuana on the federal level, the Safe Banking Act, et cetera? Do you see them just staying bottled up in committee?
I do not see movement on marijuana legislation over the next 1 to 2 years. I have been optimistic, but consistently disappointed in the way this is handled. And I certainly don't make this about my politics, but just as an observer of the politics that are controlling the destiny and the legislative landscape for the industry. We've had Democrats in power for 2 years, nothing got done. And now we've got a mixed bag in terms of who's in control. And while I don't think anyone strongly opposes the evolution of law around cannabis and marijuana, I certainly don't see a lot of momentum that would move this forward. So we've seen safe banking pass repeatedly at the House level and then fail repeatedly. Now, candidly, I don't think safe banking is a huge boon for the industry, but I do think that it would be a great notch in the belt for momentum and showing that we can get things done. But it's a pretty innocuous bill. And if we can't get safe banking through, I think a bit more about the things that would move the needle for the cannabis industry, really, namely descheduling and changing things around taxation and tax law, 280E namely. These are areas that are very meaningful. So safe banking, not very meaningful from my perspective, but would be great for momentum and a show to both investors and equity sponsors that there's movement and that the government is really doing something here. But we haven't seen it in the 2 years Democrats were in power. And now, if we can't have intra-party agreement on something as important as you reference as electing Speaker of the House, as we're sitting talking today, I think it's failed 12 times.
13.
Okay, there you go. So I missed the last one. But if we can't agree on something like that, I don't see, and I say we as a collective we, I don't see much agreement on evolution of banking law over the next, or cannabis law, I should say, over the next 1 to 2 years either.
Yeah, it doesn't make one sanguine about the prospects for marijuana legalization when the Republicans can't handle a peaceful transfer of power to themselves. But you mentioned safe bank. We've been talking about safe banking, which would prevent the law enforcement regulators from penalizing bankers from doing business with legitimate legitimate financial institutions in state legal markets. Bankers are a conservative lot, and they're wary of they tend to be a conservative lot, and they're wary of lending money to marijuana companies while there's still a federal ban. So safe banking would help solve that problem. But as you say, it's pretty innocuous. The House has passed it, 7 times, and it keeps getting bottled up in the Senate. And you mentioned 280E, and that involves the fact that marijuana companies can't take tax deductions like a lot of other companies, which really stymies marijuana entrepreneurs. You've been in the trenches you've been lending money to small businesses and entrepreneurs for about 20 years. You've seen a lot up close. What are some of the biggest mistakes you see marijuana entrepreneurs make?
Well, in the context of what you just referenced, first I'd say banking is available despite the fact that safe banking has not yet passed, right? And so they are serviced by banks. One of the mistakes some cannabis entrepreneurs make is not to bank although it's available. And there are no instances of the federal government or regulatory oversight boards penalizing banks for servicing cannabis. So I would say first and foremost, cannabis entrepreneurs should be working with a bank, and they should be transparent and honest about the industry they're in. So there are 600-700 banks that service the space, and I encourage all cannabis operators to bank their business. The other is planning. I mean, this is not an industry that can be run ad hoc. I think within the confines that we're dealing with, everything we just talked about, I would say over taxation, the fact that you can't write off cost of goods, it really requires planning. You need to know your overhead, your expense relative to your revenue, and plan accordingly. And the fact that there is debt capital available goes a long way into what your plan and your strategy is. The other is evolving. It's not limited to cannabis, John, but many entrepreneurs in general become fixated or rigid in executing on a plan. And I think when you're dealing with an environment where there is so much happening, both in the macroeconomic environment and the regulatory or the lack of movement in the regulatory space, you need to remain with a level of alacrity that some entrepreneurs don't keep in mind. So planning and then the ability to evolve that plan, both critical in addition to banking. And then, like I said, transparency and communication are also key. So as their business evolves, it's very important that they're transparent and they communicate with their vendors, their suppliers, their banks, and if they've got debt, their debt providers, so that everyone can be on the same page, because everyone is always looking to support the entrepreneur they work with. You can't do that if there's a lack of transparency or communication.
Related to that, and that was a good, thorough answer. Thank you. Useful for our readers. Related to all of that, are you seeing marijuana managers becoming more professional? Do you see more corporate savvy coming into the marijuana sector? I'm seeing it during the early days of the green rush. There were a lot of amateurs. There was a proliferation of penny stocks that went belly up, and a lot of fly-by-night operations, top executives who didn't really know what they were doing. Do you see a general professionalization of marijuana corporate management these days?
Yes, I think it's happening in two ways, John. The first is some of those early entrepreneurs, they lacked, I won't say necessarily professionalism, but I'll say experience. And so it came across, or it was perceived as a lack of professionalism, but really they just hadn't done it before. So they didn't know what to do. So I think it is a resourceful group of entrepreneurs and business operators, and they're learning as they go, and that is evolving their level of professionalism, and that is wonderful, and we're absolutely seeing that evolution take place. Young industry, sometimes it just takes a little while for the operators and the innovators to catch up. But the other is you are seeing a lot of people from outside the space that may have evolved their knowledge base and their experience levels outside of cannabis, but have always been interested or passionate about cannabis. And they're bringing their knowledge about operating and running business to the space. I am seeing both of those things happen concurrently, and it's elevating the industry as a whole. And it's a lot of fun to be a part of, a lot of fun to watch. And I think it's a big part of what's lifting the industry and enabling it to not only survive, but thrive, despite some of the headwinds that we spoke earlier regarding both economy and regulatory headwinds.
Marijuana obviously gets a lot of coverage in mainstream media. The talking heads on CNBC love to talk about pot stocks. They're story stocks. It's a sexy topic. But they tend to talk about the usual suspects, the marijuana companies like Aurora with John, speaking of House speakers, John Boehner on the board of directors. And so there's this same handful of stocks that are mentioned over and over again. I'm asking you, as someone who's an insider and has some insights that a lot of people don't have, what are some of the under the radar, underappreciated segments in the marijuana industry that make for good investment opportunities in 2023?
So I love hearing this question because in any industry, the majority of the industry is rarely spoken of. It's always kind of the big shiny object that gets the attention. And that's true of cannabis as well, in the sense that these public companies that are doing tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars and have these big listings with the marquee name directors, they get the attention. But in reality, the fabric of the industry is comprised of thousands of smaller operators throughout the entire supply chain. And then I think, to answer your question directly, the most under the radar, or kind of the least spoken of, are the ancillary providers to the space. And those are all the grow supplies, lighting, grow tables, nutrients, etc. These are amazing businesses with a ton of opportunity that will continue to thrive despite what is going on, because every grower needs the nutrients, the grow tables, the lights, or if they're building facilities, whether greenhouse, indoor, outdoor, they need all the equipment to support what they're doing. Same on the manufacturing side. They all need the equipment to do the manufacturing. And so I think these ancillary providers are really key. You've got, beyond the equipment and the grow suppliers I referenced, you have things like packaging vendors and the like. And so there's what's really interesting about the ancillary providers, John, is they service the entire supply chain. So you actually have all of this plant touching supply chain from grower through retail, everything in between. And then you have these ancillary providers that sit to the side that are servicing that entire supply chain. And so I think that's an area of great focus. And I can say for FundCanna, as we're providing capital to this industry, we see that ancillary channel not only growing, but kind of those tentacles, as they touch one area of the supply chain, it's inevitable that they're beginning to move either up or down the chain as they expand. And for me, that's amazing to watch.
I completely agree with it, and I've been making the same assertions in my publication, Marijuana Profit Alert. I'm a big fan of picks and shovels plays, ancillary companies. The marijuana industry is inherently volatile for a lot of the reasons we just discussed. And picks and shovels plays, they're more stable investments, I think. They're demonstrably more stable. One reason being they have a diversified roster of clients. Many of them do, not necessarily marijuana companies. So if the marijuana industry goes into a slump, these companies are more resilient because they serve non-marijuana companies. And they provide must-have services, and they're less vulnerable to the ups and downs of marijuana pricing, the price of the plant, because at the end of the day, marijuana plant's a commodity, and it's a plant. And so I urge my readers to look for companies that provide a value add, proprietary technology, or picks and shovels plays. We have a few picks and shovels plays in the Marijuana Profit Alert portfolio. So I completely agree with what you said.
One thing, can I add, John? One thing.
Sure, of course.
What is unique to this industry that really bolsters your argument for picks and shovels is because of the federal prohibition, you're really mandated to remain intrastate. And so as a result of that, you're really limited. I mean, unless you're a big MSO, but we already covered that, right? The fabric are not big MSOs. So you're limited. If you're in California, that's it. If you're in Illinois, that's it. But what's great about the pick and shovel plays is as new states come on, that's more opportunity for these ancillary providers. And they're able to cross lines, no problem, of geography. So you have states like New York and many others, but New York is getting a lot of press now. Whereas they come on, these ancillary providers have an entire new market. That doesn't necessarily help the cannabis supply chain if you're plant touching in Illinois. But all those pick and shovel providers that are already servicing Illinois can now also pick up New York State. So there's a lot of that I think comes into play in your recommendation.
Good stuff. Adam Stettner, founder and CEO of FundCanna. That was a very enlightening conversation. I really appreciated it. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you for your time.
You bet.